Iranian nuclear crisis. I see some kind of patch-up job that is simply going to leave this crisis, keep this crisis down the road a year or 2 or 3. There's going to be no solution in Ukraine. And as this happens, you're going to start to see other rogue states realize that it's open season, that there's no one there to maintain international order, that the liberal powers, as France, Britain, and the United States were like after the First World War, the liberal powers don't want to enforce the order they ostensibly are there to enforce. And so we're going to enter, I think, a world that looks very much like the 1920s and 30s, in which the revisionist powers revise at will, and everyone else freelances a foreign policy and crosses their fingers.
Does anybody else want to comment? Okay, we'll start with my good friend Flora Love.
Thank you so much, Fred, for organizing this evening and bringing us all together. And thanks to the 3 wonderful panelists for all the work you do and your critical-minded approach to some very sobering global issues. I agree with Brian Lee Crowley that I'm not sure that the future is clear. And I also agree that with Mr. Stevens, that if in fact the issue, and of course Mr. Mansour, the issues that are on the table today, stemming from the 7th century or the medieval times or the Ottoman Empire, and or the collapse of Ataturk and so on, if we're still dealing with those issues and they're manifesting in all kinds of horrific, barbaric evil, as we know in Boko Haram and Islamic Jihad and Hamas and Hezbollah and so on, how are we in the West, given multiculturalism, given that we're in democracies with elections that take place every 4 years, going to deal with these totalitarian rogue impacts? How can we deal with the horrors of systemic, insidious penetration of anti-Semitism in what we see art exhibits at City Hall and operas and the Met and so on, and recognizing what Mr. Stevens recognizes in the interviews, that today's young generation know nothing except their iPhones. So,
Who wants to tackle that one?
I have to look at my iPhone. Well, I'll take a stab at it with due deference to my colleague. Well, I think, the West is still a very terribly injured entity from what happened in the first half of the 20th century. And the West hasn't recovered. And the West has lost its own sense of what the West was when Britain ruled the world. And then America on the slipstream came forward after 1945. I'll take the example of India. Everyone talks about India, the world's largest democracy and so on. It's a patchwork of many things, but it is the world's largest democracy. But for Muslims, there was an alternate history. There was a fork in the road. And that alternative history, the fork in the road, was 1947. There was nothing in that sense predictable about 1947, August of 1947, because if you know the history of that part of the world, the partition of India. There was nothing predictable about it. It was not a foregone conclusion. There was nothing written anywhere in the stars that India would be divided along the lines of creating a Muslim state. And the man who is responsible for that, in that sense of responsibility, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, was, again, like many of the fundamentalists today, a man trained in the West, got his law degree in Britain, came out of Lincoln's Inn, was a complete Westerner who never knew how to speak the language of the Muslims of India, which is Urdu. And here, within a matter of 5 or 6 years, with World War II, that Jinnah proposed the breakup of India and succeeded in bringing about the breakup of India. Whereas the other leaders, including Muslim leaders, were in prison, but put there by the British. Something happened. And what happened was that Britain was broke. That the grandchildren of Victoria would completely run amok. That Winston Churchill, who would not be the emperor's last prime minister to dissolve the empire, was voted out of office as soon as the guns fell silent. And Obama of that time, Clement Attlee, was elected prime minister and began the disengagement so roughshod, so quick, that they put the man in charge. I won't get into the details, but I put a man in charge to carve up the empire who had never been to India. And 100 million Muslims at that time were on that fork on the road. The alternative history was for Britain to leave. Goddamn leave if you can't manage it, but leave it to the Indians to solve it out. And there wouldn't be no Pakistan. There would be no Taliban. That's the alternate history, the possibility. We have to imagine that. And India would be the world's largest democracy. The grandchildren of Queen Victoria would run the parliamentary constitutional system in a federated state. And the Muslim would be proud participants of the world's largest democracy. And that would have a completely different counterweight to the world that came about in terms of Islam and Muslim, because there would have been a functioning democracy with Muslims as cabinet ministers and generals and army serving a democracy, as in India they do. And most people, including Brett, and I don't want to put word in your mouth, but when you talk about Islam, we think about only the Middle East and the Arabs and Israel. And actually, Israel and the Arabs are the sideshow of a sideshow, if you understand what I mean. There's the upheaval that is going on. It is not the main show. It is a sideshow, but we are preoccupied by it. But if that had been the alternative history, the Muslim world would have been a different place today. So there is responsibility. And as you talk about Obama, that was the Clement Attlee who abandoned his responsibility. And there's a series of other things that have happened, you know. Can we recreate that? We cannot recreate that. We cannot go back and undo, you know, the broken egg, and we cannot put it all back together again. But I think the point is that the Muslim world is struggling for value. The question of legitimate authority is about obedience. In the most fundamental political philosophy question, why do men obey and give into obedience? And today, I mean, that void that was opened up has not been fulfilled. But the Muslims are struggling. The West have to isolate itself and somehow, shield itself somehow. And that's what I was talking about George Kennan. That when we need a Kennan, we don't have it. We need to quarantine the Muslim world and its malignancy to let the Muslims solve the problem. The West is not going to solve that problem.
Next question.
Thank you, Fred. You've mentioned the word West many times. You've all mentioned that as if the West has the same personality as the West did 50 years ago or 100 years ago. We don't have a West anymore. The West, to me, is gone. We're far too multicultural to be called the West. We're a bunch of wimps, mostly. I don't think we have the strength anymore for a major world war. That generation is gone.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, the question is, I'm critical of the panel for referring to the West as something of value.
Okay.
I'd like to hear your comment upon why you keep saying the West is going to be a force to solve the problem with all the multicultural we have now.
Okay, let's have them answer your question.
I'll take a first stab at that. I think you're wrong. I think the West is immense, resourceful, and here we are in the West, nowhere else, having precisely this kind of conversation. And this conversation is being had all over the place. I mean, look, the West is always in decline, always. I mean, it is in the nature of the West to convince itself that it is in decline. And just to take the American context, in 1789, Massachusetts bluestocking named Mercy Otis Warren, a playwright and a historian, predicted that we would soon be seeing upheaval and anarchy coming upon the United States. Why? Because they had been so foolish as to adopt this terrible document called the Constitution of the United States. Henry Adams, you read The Education of Henry Adams, you'll be anti-Semite, but that's another story. Convinced that America was in decline. Why? Because the old aristocracies of Virginia and Massachusetts, the Adamses and the Jeffersons, had been replaced by a new aristocracy of money, of robber barons, of unwashed immigrants, of Jews and East Europeans who were arriving by the tens of millions into Ellis Island and sort of infecting the kind of culture that you had in America in the antebellum years. So the West is constantly declining, or conservatives are constantly bellyaching that the West is in decline. And yet here we are. The last great bout of declinism before this one was the 1970s, when there were lots of reasons to think that the West had deep, deep problems. So the U.S. had just been defeated in Vietnam. The drug culture had exploded in the United States. All kinds of social ills, and crime was skyrocketing. There were racial issues. The Soviet Union was on the march. The academy had gone straight to hell. And lo and behold, the 1970s turned out to be the era when Larry Ellison founded Oracle, and Bill Gates founded Microsoft, and Steve Jobs founded Apple. And if you look at a list of the companies that are generating the greatest amounts of value, and we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in value, all came out of the 1970s, a period when, if we went back in time and we're having this conversation, let's say 1975, we have justification to say the West has gone to hell. What it turns out is that the West, for all of its, as Adam Smith said, there's a great deal of ruin in the nation, and ruin is visible. But regeneration and the sources of regeneration tend to be invisible. The guy who is about to save the West, or the woman who's about to save the West, is in some cubicle somewhere picking his nose and having an idea. And we live in a culture, remarkably, that favors that nose-picking, cubicle-dwelling nerd, right? In a way that other cultures do not. We have a culture that encourages gadflies. And the thing about gadflies is 9